So it's a great honor and pleasure to be with such a distinguished group of guests, and it's our pleasure as the Political Science and International Relations Department of İstanbul Şehir University to host this event. Today our guest is Professor Shibley Telhami. Professor Telhami will be speaking about how Middle East uprisings, or for some Arab Spring, is perceived and understood by American public. And the title he has chosen tells a little bit about the perceptions of the Americans, I guess. So this is an interesting topic. We have been following all over the regional media and academics. And so this is part of the lecture series. So this lecture is part of Debating the Global Public Lecture Series. This is the 8th lecture in this series. And we previously hosted prominent names like Fehmi Kureyli, Muhammad Ayub, Alan Burton, Michael Dillon, and Anna Devic. And Shibley Telhami is the Ambassador Professor of Peace and Development at University of Maryland College Park and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Saban Center at Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. Before coming to the University of Maryland, he taught at several universities, including Cornell University, Ohio State University, the University of Southern California, Princeton University, Columbia University, Swarthmore College, and University of California at Berkeley, where he received his doctorate in political science. He is a member of Council of Foreign Relations and served on the board of Education for Employment Foundation and several academic advisor boards. And he has served on the board of Human Rights Watch. And he also served on the board of United Institute of Peace, United States Institute of Peace. He has contributed to Washington Post, the New York Times, and Los Angeles Times, and regularly appears on the national and international media and TVs. His best-selling book, The Stakes, American and the Middle East, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in 2010. So I really used your writings in the conflict resolution class. This is really enlightening and nice. So we would like to welcome Professor Telhami. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Turkey. And although I'm here only for 24 hours, I'm happy to share this research with you. You know, obviously the Arab awakening, I call it the Arab awakening because that's really what it is. It's talking about awakening of the people that have come to life. And it has captured the imagination of the world in many ways. And so it was very interesting to investigate how the American public is viewing these Arab awakenings. What kind of impact, what kind of interpretation. And it's particularly important because when you think about what happened over the past 10 years after the tragedy of 9/11, we know that that event had an impact, not only on the way Americans view the Middle East, but really on the way Americans view Muslims and Arabs broadly. And in some ways it had an impact on the way Arabs and Muslims view America in the past decade. So we know these big events have a major paradigmatic impact. They can create shifts in perception. They can create change. And so it's very important to try to understand how these shifts occur, when they occur, how they evolve. So I started with a colleague of mine at the University of Maryland and the program on international policy attitudes to ask questions on a lot of issues in a poll that we conducted last month in April. It was a poll, it was a nationally representative sample of 802 through knowledge networks. It's a plus or minus 3.5% is the margin of error. Now, one of the questions that we asked, and we've been asking this actually in the past, and by the way, when I asked questions in this poll, I tried to find questions that have been asked before the Arab awakening, before the Arab revolutions, to see if there's change. And sometimes we repeated the same question exactly as it was asked, either by us or by someone else, to document if there's any real change. This particular question is more generic because we tried to figure out how important the American public thinks U.S. relations with the Muslim world are. You know, is this the most important issue? Is it among the top 3? Is it among the top 5? Is it not among the top 5? And so we try to get a sense of importance through that. And sometimes this is helpful, not only because it gives us a picture of how important the issue is, but it enables us to carry out statistical analysis to see if the views of people who think this is important are different from the views of people who think it's not important. So it allows us to do analysis. So this was not surprising, actually. 61% of Americans think the relations with Muslim majority countries are among the top 5 issues. About 1/3 only think they're not among the top 5 issues. You can see 18% think they're in between the 3 and the 8 and the 15. 18% the blue and the green lines combined think it's in the top 3. So this continues to be a priority issue in the perceptions of the American public. The first direct questions we asked them pertaining to the current change in the Middle East. Do you think that if countries of the Middle East become more democratic, this will be more positive or more negative for the U.S.? And we asked that question both in the short term and the long term. The short term, here we're referring obviously to the next few years versus in the long term. And you have to keep in perspective here that a lot of the arguments, particularly in the past, when the U.S. Seemed to initially support democracy and then the wrong people won, there was backtracking. The wrong people from the American point of view. We had Palestinian elections, Hamas wins, apply the brakes. So we saw that in Algeria before and other places. So the public is influenced by this debate of do they think it's going to be good or bad? You know, are the people who are going to win going to be the people they want to win? We were very surprised by this answer. In the next few years, meaning in the short term, 2/3 of Americans think it would be more positive. And less than 1/3 think it would be negative. And in the long term, it's even more so. 76% think it would be more positive, and only 19% think it would be negative. So the American public is optimistic that if there is democratization in the Middle East, it'll be better. Now, one of the fears, of course, is exactly what I expressed earlier. That what if you have democracy and then the party that wins in the election is going to be less friendly to the U.S.? Would you still support democracy? Would you support democracy even if it leads to the election of governments that are likely to oppose U.S. policies? That's the question. You know, yes, I would want to see a country become more democratic, even if this resulted in the country being more likely to oppose U.S. policies or not. And by the way, this question was asked back in 2005. You see there are 2 lines. The first line here is the recent poll that we did in April. And this line is the exact same question was asked in September of 2005 when the Bush administration was rhetorically pushing for democratization, trying to sell democratization in our world. So we wanted to have a point of comparison. Has this changed? The attitudes changed from 2005. So we asked that question in the same way that it was asked at that time. And look at this. It's really quite remarkable. 57% of the American public say, yes, they want to support, they want to see a country become more democratic, even if this resulted in the country being more likely to oppose U.S. policy. That is really quite a change, and you can see back in 2005, the public was more divided. Slightly less than half were supportive of this statement. So, you know, this is really interesting kind of change, I think, caused by people being inspired by Arab revolutions. And you'll see in some ways why that's the case. This question really tells you what the case is. Part of the debate in the U.S., of course, in Congress particularly, they say in Egypt, which is a country where there's a lot of focus on in the U.S., they see Egypt as a central player in this Arab awakening. That the fear is, what if the Muslim Brotherhood takes over in Egypt? That's one of the, you know, issues that are talked about in the U.S. In fact, when I went to brief members of Congress as the Egyptian uprising was unfolding before Mubarak fell, the first question I asked was asked by members, is the Muslim Brotherhood going to take over? What if they take over? And the second question was, what's going to happen to Israel? And so those are the two questions usually, you know, the fear of the Muslim Brotherhood and the consequences for Israel were really kind of the thing. And so basically, what I tried to do is try to figure out how the American public is seeing these events when they're watching Tahrir Square. When they watch Tahrir Square, are they seeing this as a more about Islamist groups seeking political power, or do they see it more about ordinary people seeking freedom and democracy? And that's, I labeled them this way only because that's the way the debate is. So this is not a value issue. It's a question of how they see them, how the public labels it, to see and so this is critical in my mind. This question is central because that question frames in some ways how the public is going to perceive. Are they like us or are they different from us? This is really what this question is. Are they like us or are they people I'm worried about? That's what this question is. And here's the interesting thing is that you know, the 37% who said both equally, but look at the ones who actually say one or the other. 45% say it's ordinary people seeking freedom and democracy. That's what the picture is. The plurality says ordinary people seeking freedom and democracy. Now that perception is really critical. And actually, it was so critical that those of you who don't follow American politics, you know, right after the Tahrir Square uprisings that led to the toppling of Mubarak, we had demonstrations in Wisconsin, in the middle of America, in the American Midwest that people think is so insulated from the rest of the world, using Tahrir Square slogans for a labor movement in Wisconsin. And so to think that Midwesterners are inspired by Arabs is really something quite a big, it's a change. So I think there's something here that is going on, but in part it's because they really are seeing it for what it is, which is, it's mostly about ordinary people seeking freedom and democracy, and that captured their imagination. I teach a course on international relations in the Middle East, and I was in the middle of teaching this course in my university. And when I asked my students, particularly after I showed them clips and interviews about the Egyptian Revolution, particularly, but also the Tunisian Revolution, and I asked them, what's most striking to you personally? And the number one answer among the students was, I'm surprised they're more like us. And so that the more like us is really critical here in determining kind of the outlook on a lot of these issues. You can see that in this question. How likely do you think it is that changes occurring in the Middle East will lead to more democracy there? Now remember, I suggested to you that people are optimistic that if there is democracy, it'll be better. But that's different from this question, which is, do they think that these events are going to lead to democracy or not? Very to somewhat likely, not at all, not very likely. And here, it's interesting. I mean, you know, slight majority say it's likely that they will lead to democracy, and 47% vote it's not. So the American public is divided on this, and I think realistically so. I mean, when we look at it, I mean, if you're an analyst, you have to say you might give it a little bit better than 50-50 chance, but still, this is not, you know, particularly astonishing to see that the American public is somewhat divided, with slight majority thinking that it's more likely. We asked a question about are Islam and democracy compatible? Because that obviously was a debate taking place in our discourse for the past 10 years. Do they think that the two are compatible or not? And you can imagine in our debate, Turkey was always used as an example. So Turkey had, you know, played a huge role in this Islam and democracy and compatibility, particularly among people who wanted to argue, yes, it is. You know, that this here's an example. But there are a lot of skeptics in the American political discourse. And here again, we have 2 points of comparison. One in September 2005, and the more recent one in April. And so it is possible for Islamic countries to be democratic. Democracy and Islam are incompatible. And you know, you find that there's not much change from 2005. A slight majority, 56% think Islam and democracy are compatible, but you still have a strong minority who think they're not. The views of Arab nations. And here, what we tried to do is to see if the uprisings, the Arab awakening, has changed people's views about countries in the Middle East. And when we say countries, meaning we don't really differentiate governments and people, we just say countries. And then we ask a separate line of questions about people. Your attitude about the people of the Arab world, the people of Egypt, the people of Saudi Arabia. And this particular question, you know, what is your opinion of each of the following countries, favorable, unfavorable? We used this language because it had been asked in 2010 and earlier in 2011. So again, we had a comparison point so we could tell whether there is a somewhat slight positive change or no change at all. We could tell. And here you can see, start with Saudi Arabia. Clearly an improvement, because if you look at 2010, only 35% had positive views, favorable views. In April, the latest poll we did 44%. Clear, you know, a statistically significant improvement. Syria, the last poll was done in 2007. You know, obviously Syria in American discourse does not have very favorable views in general, but still an improvement. You can see from 21% to 32%. And that was, by the way, before things erupted in Syria. You have to keep that in mind, because this happened on April 11. Really was the April 2011. Before, the Syrian revolution has really been underway for about a little over a month. This was done before that. Egypt, there was a initial decline in February 2011, but then now it's 60% favorable views of Egypt. Egypt, by the way, generally had more positive views than any other Arab country in America. When you ask them to the views of the country, more people have positive views of Egypt than any other Arab country. Now here's the question that is more telling, because that was about countries, and when you ask about countries, people don't differentiate between governments and people. They're lumping them all together, and so you can't be sure what they mean by it exactly. So we asked a specific question about views of the Arab people, because remember, what is this all about? I mean, what is the revolution about? What is the awakening about? It's about the people going to the streets, the people, you know, people's voice being heard. So we wanted to ask specifically how the public is viewing the Arab people, favorable or unfavorable. Well, look at the numbers. They're really quite extraordinary. A majority of the Arab people, the majority of Americans, 56%, have an overall favorable view of the Arab people. Saudi Arabia is 57%. Egypt, 70%. 70% of the American public has a favorable view of the Egyptian people. And now let me tell you something really interesting about this. This is almost exactly the same percentage of Americans who have a favorable view of the Israeli people. That is unheard of in the American context. And that you would have this kind of equation of favorable views of people. So it's very striking, this particular question. And I also think it's very interesting because I do Arab public opinion polls. I do public opinion polls in the Arab world. Every year I have a major annual Arab public opinion poll. I've been doing it for a decade. And I repeat some of the same questions every year and I ask new ones. And I'm about to do another one next month. But in 2010, before the Arab revolutions, I asked a question about how the Arab people view the American people. Normally, all of our questions, how do you view the United States? We knew that was overwhelmingly negative. You know, 90% of the Arab public practically had a negative view of the U.S. Very high. But a lot of people argued that that's not exactly the same as the view of the American people. Well, in 2010, we asked a question about Arab views of the American people, and actually a majority of the Arabs said they had a negative view of the American people, unfavorable view of the American people. That somehow, not quite as much as they have of the U.S. Overall, but of the American people. And so it's striking actually to see that in light of the Arab revolutions, you have a majority of Americans actually have a positive view of the Arab people. And I think that that's particularly telling. What about measuring the effects of the uprising and their perceptions? Has the level of sympathy for the Arab people increased or decreased? The sense of how similar the aspirations of the Arab people are to your own. Has that increased or decreased? And again, here you can see on the sympathy for the Arab people, 39% say it increased, only 6% say it decreased. The others say it didn't change, but you can see where the change is much more favorable. 33% say their sense that the Arab people are like themselves, increased. 9% say it decreased. So huge difference between those who say it increased. In responding to the popular uprising in the following countries, do you think the U.S. should express support for demonstrators, not take a position, express support for the government? Now this is going to be interesting because this is really gets into something different here, which is, do you want the U.S. to play a role in this or not? Okay, so you're sympathetic with the Arab people, but do you want the U.S. to take a role in this? Look at that. In every country, ranging from Syria to Bahrain to Yemen to Jordan to Saudi Arabia, 2/3 of the American public say, basically, don't intervene. However, those who want the U.S. to intervene, which are roughly about 30%, on the blue and the brown, if you look at the blue and the brown, those are the people who want the U.S. to take sides. Overwhelmingly, they want the U.S. to take the people's side, not the government's side. And that's true even in places where the governments seem to be extremely important for American foreign policy, such as Saudi Arabia, where you have only 10% say express support for the government versus 21% say express support for the government. So obviously Syria, you have quite a bigger gap on top. But this really expresses in some ways the American public attitudes. The American public is sympathetic, their views are shifting, but they don't really want to see America get involved. They're tired of the Iraq War, they're tired of the Afghan War. They also know this is not about America. This is one of the inspiring things about the Arab uprisings. They were spontaneous, they were local, they were not instigated from the outside. And there was this momentum, don't make this about America. Don't make America a party to these changes. Compatibility of Muslim and Western cultures, these are questions that we've asked in the past. Wanted to see whether those perceptions change. Thinking about Muslim and Western cultures, do you think that it is possible to find common ground between them, or violent conflict between them is inevitable? And interestingly, 59% say common ground is possible, but you do have a significant minority that think it's, conflict is inevitable. We asked a specific question about Libya because we know when Libya in some ways is seen to be an exception. It seemed to be an exception because people believe Gaddafi really was about to carry out atrocities. In part because he actually did threaten to do so. And so the American public initially supported, despite all the opposition, supported the president's decision to join the coalition against Gaddafi in Libya. And so what we tried to ask here is whether there's still support or disapprove of this intervention. But we also had asked the question in an identical fashion to the question that was asked back in March by CBS News, because we wanted to see whether the support is declining or increasing over time. So we found that actually still a majority of Americans supported the intervention in Libya, but it was a declining majority. 54% supported in April, but 68% supported in March, so it's a declining majority, but still a majority.
Why do you think there was this decline?
Pardon me?
Why do you think there was this decline between March and April?
Because I think the president came under a lot of criticism from a lot of quarters for fear that this is going to expand. And initially, when the initial intervention took place, there was a sense that an intervention against the civilians by Gaddafi was imminent. And a lot of people raised questions about whether it was imminent or not. And I think the American public initially believed that this would be quick, that this would be, that it'll tip the balance. Gaddafi will be gone in 2 weeks, and obviously several weeks went on, and he was not toppled, so they were worried about expansion. You can see that in the next question, which is, okay, so you support this intervention up to now. How about arming the rebels? If the intervention was enough, would you support at least arming the rebels? We didn't ask a question about deploying American ground forces because we knew that would be completely opposed. I mean, that would not have been a finding at all. I mean, the overwhelming majority of Americans do not want to see American ground forces deployed anywhere, let alone Libya, where it's much harder to make a case for an American national interest. So we asked the question that was actually being debated, which is, should the coalition, particularly the U.S., supply weapons to the rebels, and to see whether the public was even open to that, and it looks like the public was not open to that. 59% were opposed, and 36% supported. And I think it's a slippery slope fear. The American public really now is very cautious about intervention. It's not an interventionist view, and they worry that this could lead to something else. Approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I have to say that this is a question I've been asking quite a bit over the past decade, so it's not new anyway, but this exact wording of this question we asked in another poll that we did in November 2010. So we had some point of comparison. And you can see here, we wanted to see whether there's any kind of impact, whether there's any kind of relationship that is that you can, between attitudes toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and attitudes toward the Arab awakening. And so we asked the question: is do you think the U.S. should lean toward Israel, lean toward neither side, or lean toward the Palestinians? What do you think the U.S. position should be on this issue? Look at the green, which is basically 2/3 of Americans think that the U.S. should lean toward neither side. That has been consistently, by the way, the position, the finding in almost every poll that we have asked for the past decade. Roughly 2/3 of Americans say they don't want the U.S. to take sides in the conflict. They want the U.S. to lean toward neither side. Roughly 2/3. However, of those who want the U.S. to take sides, which is, of course, the group that matters a lot, you can see that in the April poll, roughly 5-1, they want the U.S. to lean toward Israel. 27% want the U.S. to lean toward Israel, 5% want the U.S. to lean toward the Palestinians. Now, I should tell you something here that might be helpful. I'm not going to show the slide, but we did some demographic analysis of this group. Who are the people in the blue? Who are the people in the green and brown? But mostly the green. First, party matters a lot. When I divide them by Republicans and Democrats, among Republicans, over 45% are in the blue. Almost half Republican, half of the Republicans, almost half of the Republicans want the U.S. to lean toward Israel. You have to understand the Republican Party has become a major constituency. And that's why, the Prime Minister of Israel, when he was speaking at the joint session of Congress, he's in part focused on, he has support in the Democratic Party as well, but he is particularly focused on the Republican Party because that has become a hardline constituency. But second, and related to this Republican Party, is that at the core of that is this evangelical right. And not Jewish Americans, by the way, because very few Jewish Americans are Republican. Jewish Americans are primarily Democrat. Obama got 78% of the Jewish vote, and will still get a majority of the Jewish vote in next election. It doesn't matter what happens between the Prime Minister. Most American Jews actually don't rank the issue of Israel their top priority, and they vote on party line, on social issues, on economic issues, or whatever, regardless of what happens. And in any case, they're a small minority. I mean, we're talking about 2% of the population, maybe 2.5% of the population. I don't know exactly, but very small percentage of the population. Here you're talking about 27%. The Republican Party, you're talking about 45%. Huge percentages. So that's it. The evangelical right is a huge constituency. And by the way, the Prime Minister of Israel in his speech to Congress highlighted this biblical link. We're not occupiers. The Jewish people are not occupiers of Judea and Samaria. They belong there. He's trying to build on this evangelical. He's basically addressing this constituency. He's trying to hammer it because a lot of them actually believe it. And so he's building on that more and more. And second, men are more likely to be on the blue than women. Women are more likely to be neutral than men. Third, the young people are more likely to be neutral. And the old people are more likely to be in the blue. Fourth, African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to be neutral or pro-Palestinian than white Americans. So the blue constituency profile is older white males Republican. That's really the intensity of it. That you find more concentration in that profile, in that category is what we found. We asked a question about which of the following is closest to your view of the Obama administration diplomatic effort to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Is it at the right level? Is the administration not trying hard enough? Is it at the right level or trying too hard? And we found that really there's, the plurality say it's the right level. This hasn't changed from November, and then they're divided almost equally between those who say trying too hard and not trying hard enough. So that was not particularly informative about where the public is. I'm going to end with this, but I want to make a final comment on how I'm interpreting this, and in some ways connected to what the President's speech in part was trying to do. Big events like the Arab Awakening are occasions for paradigmatic shifts in worldview, just as 9/11 was. And what we see is the immediate reaction of the American public based on what they saw in the streets of the Arab world, particularly in Egypt, is something that influenced them positively. That now you have a majority of Americans having a favorable view of the Arab world, and more importantly, thinking of Arabs as, quote, more people like us, which is a profound change from the kind of paradigm that took place after 9/11, where there was a sense of, quote, they hate us for our values, they hate us for our freedom, while the Bush administration really was referring to Al-Qaeda when it usually formulated that. The public discourse degenerated into thinking Muslims are like that, or many Muslims are like that. They hate us for, this is a clash of values, a clash of civilizations. This is they don't like our freedom, they don't like our democracy. And what the American public was internalizing from the Tahrir Square pictures was they're prepared to die for freedom and democracy. This is exactly the opposite of the image that was being. It is the anti-Bin Laden, it's the anti-Al-Qaeda, it's the anti-model that generated the fear of the American public. So it started to create a shift. But I have to say, these shifts don't necessarily last. So while they begin, how they unfold cannot be taken for granted. And a lot of people don't realize that after 9/11, in the first few weeks after 9/11, actually the American public did not have a negative view of Muslims around the world, despite 9/11. They accepted the notion that Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization and that most Muslims are in another place. There was far more interest in Islam the first few weeks in America than any time before. And when you ask them questions about their positive views, they had more positive views of Muslims. And that unfolded differently throughout the decade. And one reason it unfolded differently was that the Bush administration put on the table some foreign policy paradigm that was used internally to shift public views. Iraq War had a lot to do with it, but also because as the U.S. moved in a particular direction, especially the Iraq War I think was more important as a turning point than 9/11 itself. And the Iraq War is really, even here in the Middle East, Arab and Muslim public opinion after 9/11 was not as hostile to the U.S. There was even some sympathy with the U.S., I think, in many parts of the Arab and Muslim world. And I think that started shifting as the U.S. geared up toward the Iraq War. And then the discourse deteriorated. So that paradigm could have gone in multiple directions. It was not automatic that 9/11, therefore, you could have this clash of views. I think leaders have a role to play in bolstering and building a paradigm. And that's why I thought that when President Obama gave his speech about the Arab awakening last Thursday, the most important audience for this speech was not the Arab or Muslim audience, it was actually the American audience. Because what the president was trying to do was, for one thing, obviously explain to American people what American policy is, because they were not sure. But more importantly, to create a paradigm in the context of which he can recommend policies such as supporting the people of the Middle East, assuring the success of the revolutions, giving money to the newly democratizing states. And in that sense, the president really was helping solidify these findings. And you heard the president, for example, speak of, when he spoke of the example about what drove the Tunisian Revolution and the Egyptian Revolution. And he gave examples from American history. Rosa Parks, positive image. The Tea Party, positive image. They are like us. What drives them is what drives us. And then he talks about these events are akin to what happened after the demolition of the Berlin Wall. European context, positive image. That is all extremely important, the consolidation of a paradigm that eventually will be very important for foreign policy. And you have to work at it, otherwise it's not guaranteed that it will stay, because events will undoubtedly challenge some of the perceptions that we're facing. And these events are going to unfold, and there will inevitably be some ugliness that come out of revolutions, always. And so you have to work at it to consolidate this view. So I personally think that it's very important to keep this in mind. And it's very important, one of the really fascinating thing about Arab revolutions, in my own view, is not only that they've been less ideological and very focused on very universal values in their advocacy, but that they have been astonishingly peaceful. And I mean astonishingly, I think in some ways, you can make an argument objectively about why the Arab people were angry with the governments. That's not hard to make. And we've been making it for decades. In fact, the puzzle has been not when will Arabs have reason to revolt against the governments. The puzzle has always been, why haven't Arabs revolted already? And that has been the real question. And second, we know that the information revolution created empowered the public and presented mechanism of mobilization. Those are objective. You could say, we knew the public was angry, we knew now they have an instrument to mobilize, therefore we have an objective explanation. It's very hard to come up with an objective explanation as to why this revolution has been largely peaceful. Why the winning slogan in Tahrir Square or in Tunis, or for that matter in Sana'a, which is even more surprising, is Silmiya, Silmiya, Silmiya, Silmiya, peaceful, peaceful, peaceful, yes, even when they're being assaulted. That is really a remarkable thing, and I think it's I'm thinking of it increasingly as an emerging norm that is kind of infecting the revolution across the board, because it's working in terms of the responsiveness, its power and the international responsiveness to it. And that's really remarkable, and I think that's one reason why we have this emerging positive view, is that you have this incredible norm that is being established, but obviously you know that it's going to be challenged as people move forward. So I'll stop with that and open it for questions. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, Professor Telhami. So, it's really interesting, your findings. My feeling was the American public was more indifferent to what's going on in the foreign affairs in general. So, this survey showed that they're really following quite. And the other thing is that they're differentiating between the government and the people, and they have very positive feelings about people, and they are quite supportive of the democratization. And but on the other hand, they don't support American involvement in the Middle East, so they have quite questions. So I would like to open the discussion, but before that I would like to ask the first question. So how do you evaluate Obama factor in these developments? Can he really change people's mindset about the Middle East, and is he really leading in this debate about uprisings or Arab Spring? So what's his role?
I think presidents matter a lot. They don't have all the power, as you can see, in our democratic politics. Congress has a lot of power. Interest groups have a lot of power, but the president's most important power, actually, is in defining the national interest and defining the worldview for Americans to evaluate. And so that power has been extremely important. And on that, I think Obama has done quite a lot since he's been president. You could argue that his Middle East policy has not succeeded, that his diplomacy has not resulted in anything tangible, but you cannot argue with the fact that he moved away from the clash of civilization model. And that is effective. And in this particular environment, where if there was, I could have imagined another president in his place, who had gone to the American people and highlighted the fear, just like the Prime Minister of Israel when he went to speak to Congress. He said, yeah, we would like democracy too, but don't underestimate how threatening militant Islam remains, and that is the biggest problem that we still face. You could have had a president of America go out and make that same argument. And instead we have a president who's, now it doesn't mean he's always going to prevail, but it does have an impact. And I think on that, the president has done everyone a service from the day he came to office to now, kind of redefining the paradigm and walking away from this model that was, I think, disastrous for all of us, disastrous for particularly for the U.S. relations with Muslim.
So let's have the questions. So I will be happy if you introduce yourself.
Okay. Betin Kılıç, I'm a PhD student, candidate in the Department of Linguistics and Languages and Cultures at Indiana University, Bloomington. And your presentation reminded me of one of Edward Said's op-ed pieces published by Le Monde Diplomatique. He was complaining about the fact that Middle Eastern people, according to him, are generally oblivious of American public opinion, and they show no interest in understanding American domestic politics. And based on this, thank you very much for sharing your findings. That's enlightening findings with us. My question would be about methodology. You expressed that planning matters in explaining views about American role in Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how political party affiliation affected the answer the respondents gave. But here, did you control for this variable for all questions in the study? Like you have 800 respondents, and did you control for their political party?
Sure.
And that's surprising because some of the findings are very surprising to us, and at least opposed to like impressionistic, arguments about American publics in the Middle East. And second, 800 respondents, like sample size, your sample size is enough to generalize your findings for all Americans. This is the second.
The second is the easiest. I mean, I think if you know anything about polling, it's definitely a sufficient size to capture national consent. It's always about the margin of error. So the margin of error is 3.5 plus or minus 3.5%. So if we should double it, it'll reduce the margin of error, but it wouldn't make it any more representative. So it's really all about, the scientific way of capturing, that's plenty enough. And this is not even disputed in the field. That's obviously, we always like to reduce the margin of error if we can, with a bigger sample, but 300 is is sufficient to be able to do that. Now, on the first one, yeah, of course we have demographic analysis. I didn't present it because it's, you know, obviously we can get into that, but and there's overlap, for example, on some of the questions pertaining to the compatibility of Islam and democracy. You find more Republicans actually saying they're incompatible than Democrats, so we find that partisan division. But one of the things that's interesting is when we look at if Americans want the U.S. to support democracy, even if governments are going to be less friendly to the U.S., we find that both Republicans and Democrats say yes. So the partisan issue is just a matter of small degrees, but not the trend. It's still the same. But demographics, you know, matter, particularly age is really a factor. More so than in the Arab world, by the way. In Arab public opinion, surprisingly, age is less critical as a factor in accounting for foreign policy views. But in the U.S. it is, and I think it probably has to do with a number of things, including the fact that the younger people now get their information and is from sources other than the older people. And in the Arab world, while the internet is expanding, percentage-wise, it's still not huge, and only the last 3 years have been able to measure the differences between those who use the internet and not, because it's just still not a huge sample. And as you know, age matters for the use of the internet because the younger people use it far more, even in the U.S. And so you have, you know, who gets the news from TV, who gets the news from the internet. When I ask in the Arab world, I ask, where do you get, what's your primary source of news? The overwhelming majority of Arabs, including the users of the internet, say satellite TV. And Al Jazeera is #1 in every country. You know, it alone accounts for 88% of Arabs say Al Jazeera is either their first choice of news or second choice of news, with all the different options that are available. So it's a huge percentage of people who watch Al Jazeera. It's just the single most important news source, even with the availability of all the others. In the U.S., if I ask the young people, where do you get your source of, your principal source of news, the internet is #1 by far in the U.S. You know, in my classroom, I also do that casually every time just to get a sense of the cloud. You know, how many of you get your news from TV? I had a single person raise their hand. And even those who watch TV, they typically watch it on the internet. That is, they go on demand and they click. So it's changing. You know, that's definitely the source of information is a critical factor. And in America, there is a difference, generational difference in the source of information. And by the way, that would also explain. I happen to think that the internet is far more democratic. I mean, you know, troubling sometimes, obviously, as you see, it's far more democratic, equalizes. In the ordinary media is hegemonic because you have, it's about resources, it's about politics, it's about power. So those who control the traditional media are going to be those interest groups in society that has interest in information, owners, you know, people who have money, people who have interest in putting it, and those major media outlets will be more responsive to them, particularly in this squeezed environment of media in the U.S. Whereas in the internet, it's far more open, and you know, and people who didn't have a voice now have a voice. So you find suddenly, you know, when people go into websites or blogs that absolutely have no money behind them or no, you know, and so the public. That's one reason why I think that young people are having, you know, independent views because their views are not being similarly shaped by the dominant traditional media, and you know, it could change, but for now I think it's happening in the U.S.
Can I ask
Pardon me?
Can I ask you a question with Arabic?
تفضل.
يعني هذا الاستطلاع الرأي العام في الولايات المتحدة أنتم كمؤسسة في الولايات المتحدة يعني هل الحكومة الأمريكية تحدد سياستها الخارجية حسب هذا الاستطلاع الرأي العام؟
If you don't want, I'll translate.
Can you
I'll translate.
either summarize in English or Turkish? So,
American government dominates its policies, the foreign policies, according to this
Public opinion.
public opinion.
Well, does the American government make its policy based on public opinion polls? Of course not. I mean, public opinion polls matter a lot to politicians. American politicians worry about public opinion polls. And when a government is popular... الولايات المتحدة طبعا لا تصنع قراراتها السياسية من خلال استطلاع الرأي العام، ولكن كل السياسيين في الولايات المتحدة متأثرين بالرأي العام. فمثلا الرئيس اوباما حاليا له شعبية، خاصة بعد مقتل أسامة بن لادن، فله شعبية في الولايات المتحدة، ولذلك يتخوف منه بعض أعضاء الكونغرس عندما يكون له شعبية. عندما يتخذ أي خطوة الرئيس أو العضو في الكونغرس يجب أن يعرف إذا كان لهذه الخطوة شعبية أم لا قبل أن يتخذ هذه الخطوة. فلذلك عندما يقدم الرئيس كما قدم في يوم الخميس السابق تحليل للقضايا العربية، هذا التقديم الذي يقوم به يعرف أنه لا يتعارض مع الرأي العام الأمريكي، فهذا يساعد طبعا. فإن لم يكن ذلك كان يصعب عليه أن يقدم مثل هذا التفسير إذا لم يكن هذا التفسير موجود حاليا على الخط بين الجمهور الأمريكي. لذلك له تأثير، ولكن القرارات السياسية طبعا معقدة ولها أسباب مختلفة.
And why Islamic people, Americans and women and young people in the movement, US, they are seeing themselves closest to the Palestinian question?
Well, I wouldn't say they're seeing themselves close to the Palestinian side. I say they're more neutral. I mean, the truth of the matter is the vast majority of Americans are neutral. The vast majority, the American instinct is one of neutrality and not taking side. That's the American instinct. And usually those who take sides are a minority. But of those who take sides in the American public, more people take Israel's side than the Palestinian side. That formula shrinks a little bit for the younger people. It's not as daunting as it is for the general public. So it's not that there is a leaning to what the Palestinians, there is not a strong constituency for the Palestinians in America. It tends to be more Arab Americans, a little bit of African, there's more sympathy among African Americans. By the way, that was in some ways some of the discomfort in Israel about Obama originally, as some of the newspapers express it explicitly, that while they didn't know a lot about him, they assumed that he might be more sympathetic by virtue of who he is. I mean, that kind of argument you find. But I think the young people generally tend to be more neutral anyway, and they're more to the left. And you can see the base of the Democratic Party are people in that, women, young people. This is the coalition that helped elect Obama. African Americans, Hispanics, the young generation, that is really now the core of the Democratic Party. And in some ways, many of those people who are diehard, part of the Republican Party, particularly the religious right, are not going to support President Obama anyway. They're just not going to be in his camp.
When you say that a group of people are more neutral, is it just because of that they are really neutral, or they just don't want to be a part of foreign policy, and maybe they really do not care? And how can we be sure?
Well, actually, I do measure that. But let me just first answer generically, because the truth of the matter is actually the American people, their instinct is more fairness. That's the instinct. You know, the ethos coming out of the culture is fairness. Now, maybe they think they're first class or not, that's a different story. But the instinct is to be fair. That is the bulk of the public, that's the instinct. And you find it in a lot of other issues. But you did ask me a question that's important. Is it that they don't care? And actually, we measure that. So one of the things I always ask, just like I asked that question about relations with the Muslim world, I asked how people rank an issue. And on the Arab-Israeli issue, I didn't show you this because this was a more extended analysis. I asked the public, is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict the single most important issue to you? Is it in the top 3? Is it in the top 5? Is it not in the top 5? And then I tried to break down and see who are the people who rank it high, because they're the people who are going to care about it. That is, if you rank it high, it means you're going to vote on the basis of that issue. If you rank it in the top 3, you probably even contribute to politicians. So in America, what matters most for the political process are people who really care about issues. I call them the issue public. In fact, I wrote an article about it, with a colleague of mine about the issue public and American policy, because this is really all about how important an issue is, because it tells you who are the people who are likely to make a difference on the issue. And so we break it down. And so we have a lot of answers on that. And so when you, it's the same exact demographics. You find that the people who rank the issue number 1 tend to be far more pro-Israel than the 2. Almost 50%, even more, I think. In the top 3, it's like 40%. In the top 5, it goes down to less, and then not in the top 5, the people who don't care, but then they more like what you suggested. So we have there's a little bit of correlation. There's a little bit of correlation on that issue.
Can you also introduce yourself?
My question will not be related to this course. I want to learn your personal view about Great Middle East project. You know, that project was declared by Bush during Bush time. It was very popular in our country and in our Arab world and in the world. But his highlight to achieve this goal was occupying countries. That didn't work, and after him, Obama came on power. And now he's trying to achieve same target, but different, in a different paradigm. Do you think that is it believable? And do you think that Muslim countries, Middle East countries believe him? That's my question.
Well, let's start with the first part, which is the Greater Middle East Project. I think it's a stupid idea because I don't really know what that means. I don't know what a Greater Middle East is. I mean, I know if you want to break countries regionally, Afghanistan and Lebanon have very little in common. Pakistan and Morocco have very little in common. I'm not even comfortable personally with the term Muslim world, and not because I don't think Muslims have many things in common. They do, and obviously, particularly when there's a kind of a sense that there's somebody is focused on it and rallied. I mean, after 9/11, sort of the fear of clash of civilization and DC, the reaction to it. But I'm not sure that it makes sense to call the Muslim world, to call the countries that have Muslim majorities Muslim world. I mean, why should being a Muslim be the most important characteristic of the country? We don't say Christian world. technically Venezuela and Russia and the United States are all Christian majority countries. Nobody will call them part of the Christian world. I mean, they have different foreign policy. Religion is only one part of what the culture is, or one part of certainly what foreign policy is inside. So I personally, I'm not comfortable with it. And frankly, the president in his Sparrow speech, if you look at it very carefully, he actually avoided using the term Muslim world. He took it out of the discourse because of what I just suggested. Because I think it sort of biases your view. You start seeing everybody through the prism of the fact they're a Muslim, when in fact you got to see them as human beings, or as you're going to look at their economy, you're going to look at their culture, you're going to look at their interests, you're going to look at them for what they are. So I see that as a problem, I think, in the discourse. That's why we need this paradigmatic shift on both sides. We need to have it from the American side, we need to have it in this region. I think it is something that. What was the second question? I'm sorry.
Only one question.
Okay, one question. All right. So I answered it, right?
My name is Saib. I'm Fulbright Fellow from Chicago doing my research here in Istanbul. I wanted to ask you regarding the recent speech that Netanyahu made to Congress, and it seems that among some Americans, the fact that the majority of Americans are neutral on the topic, how do you think the neutral American public is reacting towards, everyone in Congress pretty much standing up and applauding to a lot of the quite radical things that were being said? I know it just happened, so I don't know if you've done any research on this, but how do you see it developing from among the neutral population?
Well, most Americans, in general, are not going to rank Christians behind the priorities. So even if they're angry with a member of Congress, they don't care enough about the issue. And that's why I think, if you're a member of Congress, if you take a position that is critical of Israel, you're going to feel the heat. If you take a position that is critical of the Arabs, you're not going to feel any heat at all. So which one will you do? It doesn't matter whether most of the people are neutral or not. So I think by and large, this is something that is understood, and that's why when you have the Prime Minister of Israel go in and give a speech, you're going to have more applause than is given to the President of the United States. And he had I don't know how many people counted the ovations, over 50 ovations during that speech. So I think that's that they're not likely to. Individuals will challenge them. There will be anger. There will be some people who will write. But in the end, I don't think no one has an incentive to go against them. Just not going to happen. Not in Congress.
So, okay, I'll have the last question, so maybe we can continue discussion when we are having tea outside.
Last thing is about Turkey, if you don't mind. You said that you're making Arab opinion polls regularly. What do the Arab people actually think about Turkey being a model? Because these have both negative and positive meanings.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, because Turkey comes up in my polls in the Arab world in a couple of ways. One way, I ask a question every single year, whom among world leaders do you admire most? And it's an open question. You can name anybody you want. And interestingly, during the Iraq War in 2003, it was Jacques Chirac, both friends, because he stood up to Bush. In the 2006 after the Lebanon War, was Hassan Nasrallah. In 2008, it was the Prime Minister of Turkey, because of the Gaza. So the Prime Minister of Turkey has been popular, particularly over the past 2-3 years in the Arab world. Among the top 3 leaders, actually. Name an open question. I don't even give them a name. Just say, whom among world leaders do you admire most? So that comes up. I also have a question: is which countries do you think are playing a constructive role in the Middle East? And Turkey is among the positive view of Turkey over the past few years. And while Arabs in general don't like to refer to other models outside the Arab world, sort of like particularly Egyptians.
Arab nationalists.
Yeah, Arab nationalists. Nonetheless, in the Egyptian discourse, the Turkish model is being used, which is kind of interesting. So you heard it by a lot of people, activists who are talking about the Turkish model. And so it's being used in the discourse. I don't know, and many of the analysts, when they say, okay, so what could you hope that Egypt would be, they will say, well, probably somewhere like Turkey was maybe 10 years ago, or something like that, because I think it'll be a lag. So you hear that a little bit, but I'm not sure yet about public opinion, because I'm going to probably ask something about that in next month when I do mine, about how they're reacting to the revolutions and having a little bit of a sense of that.
So I would like to thank Professor Telhami for this